Alright, my people, have you noticed how for many years, whenever Africa needed a voice on the global stage, that voice almost always come from South Africa, whether addressing the world highest court, challenging Israel over alleged human rights violation, or representing African interests in forums like BRICS and the G20. South Africa often positioned itself as the continent's latest representative. But today, that long-standing absorption is beginning to face serious questions. Across Africa, governments are quietly asking whether South Africa still has the moral authority to speak on behalf of an entire continent, while many Africans say they no longer feel welcome within its own borders. As Pretoria calls for justice and human rights internationally, a very different reality is unfolding at home. Africans are being chased from hospitals. Migrants are hunted by organized groups. Some South African citizens are mistaken for foreigners because of how they look, their names, and the language they speak. You see, this story goes far beyond immigration. At its heart, it's about leadership, credibility, and whether a nation can continue claiming the moral high grounds while struggling to uphold those same values within its own borders. By the end of this discussion, you will understand why countries like Ghana and Nigeria, as well as some South African leaders themselves, are beginning to challenge that long-held belief that South Africa automatically speaks for all of Africa. Let's start with the moment that everything began to change. It started with a date, June 30th. If you have followed my previous report, you are already familiar with the collation, the race, and the door-to-door operations, so I won't revisit those details. Instead, let's focus on something even more revealing: what became known as the Great Liberation March. For decades, the word liberation symbolizes South Africans' victory over apartheid and the struggle for freedom. Today, however, that same word has taken a very different meaning for some groups. Now, it is being used to justify marches demanding that fellow Africans leave the country. At the center of this movement is Jacinta Kupesi Zuma, leader of March and March, whose repeated message has become one of its defining slogans: foreigners are the new colonizers. That statement carries enormous weight in a country whose history is deeply shaped by colonial oppressions. Comparing fellow Africans to colonizers places them alongside those who once ruled South Africa through force and discrimination. Initially, it is easy to assume these demonstrations were simply emotional reactions from frustrated citizens facing unemployment and economic hardship. But a closer look suggested something different. Research into the hospital blockade showed that these actions were not random. They appeared carefully organized, with advanced planning, designated locations, and specific dates. Rather than spontaneous protests, they resembled coordinated operations. One migrant interviewed during the investigation shared a disturbing observation that remained difficult to ignore. He explained that authorities didn't first examine their documents, they reacted to their names. That single statement raises uncomfortable questions about how identity itself has become a reason for exclusion. You know, South Africa's constitution guarantees access to healthcare for everyone within its borders, regardless of immigration status. When private individuals prevent patients from entering public hospitals, they are effectively placing themselves above the country's own constitution. Now, here is where the surface story flips. There is a common line in South Africa that foreigners take our jobs, they steal our jobs, foreigners drain our services, foreigners don't pay tax. Now, fact checkers found out that South Africa isn't even on the top 20 Africa's 54 countries for hosting refugees. Now, what does that mean? Africa has 54 countries. South Africa isn't even on the top 20 of African countries hosting other African refugees. Yet, when this started, some of us actually thought that the refugee situation in South Africa is crazy. You know, there are other African countries, more than 20 of them, that are supporting other Africans from other African countries without complaint. And these countries are poorer than South Africa. So the spirit of Ubuntu still really has a lot of gap to occupy in South Africa. You see, the more I look into this, the stranger everything got. Jacinta also said this on camera.
African countries came to fight with black people.
She claimed, frequently repeated, is that the rest of Africa did little to support South Africa during apartheid. But history tells a different story. Nigeria, for example, dedicated approximately 2% of its civil servant salaries over several years to support the anti-apartheid struggle. That contribution amounted to billions of dollars, resources that could have been invested in Nigerians' own development, but were instead committed to helping South Africans achieve freedom. During a televised interview, journalist Arita confronted Jacinta with documented evidence of Nigerians' contributions, exposing the gap between historical facts and popular narrative. Sometimes, when people insist Africa never helped South Africa, it sounds less like forgotten history and more like an attempt to erase a debt that has become uncomfortable to acknowledge. You know, an old African proverb captured this idea perfectly. A blind man who finally regains his sight often throws away the walking stick that guided him. That walking stick was held by many nations: Nigeria, Ghana, Tanzania, Zambia, and others. Yet today, many of their citizens find themselves facing hostility on South African streets. These growing tensions also explains why Ghana has raised concern before the African Union, and why Nigeria has reportedly issued warning to its citizens. These actions are about far more than protecting nationalists abroad. They signal to the rest of Africa that South Africa's moral credibility is no longer beyond questions. Imagine being a policymaker in Accra, watching this event unfold and asking yourself one simple question: why should a country that struggles to protect fellow Africans at home continue speaking for the entire continent abroad? You see, South Africa earned worldwide recognition when it brought 8 cases before the International Court of Justice, arguing that Israel had violated international law. That decisions won admiration across much of the world, and there is no denying the significance of that moment. But it also raises a difficult question. If a country can so clearly recognize injustice taking place thousands of kilometers away, why does that same moral clarity seem less visible when fellow Africans face discrimination within its own borders? As migrants report being denied healthcare, intimidated, or forced away from public services, the International Commission of Jurists has urged South Africa to take immediate action against xenophobia and vigilante violence. The organization called on the government to uphold the very human rights standards it expects from other nations to respect. That's an international legal body saying it, not a rival politician. Moral authority in geopolitics is currency. It is why a country gets a seat at the UN, a seat at BRICS, a seat at the table when African interests are decided by people who aren't African. Another reality often overlooked is that major global powers do not simply value South Africa, they value Africa as a whole. Countries such as China ultimately depends on collective support of all 54 African nations in international institutions. If the continent ever decided to speak with a broader, more unified voice instead of relying primarily on one country, global partners will inevitably adjust. At the same time, another international narrative has been unfolding. While African migrants inside South Africa have been pressured to leave, international attention has also focused on white Afrikaners seeking refugee pathway abroad under claims of persecution. Now, frame both headlines at once. African migrants told to leave by a deadline. A different group, same country, claiming to leave too for a different reason, getting international spotlight. Now, remember that I told you that some leaders inside South Africa are pushing back to. Not every South African is in this light we just described. And here is one of them, Limpopo Premier, Dr. Fofi Ramathuba. She publicly told March and March that her province has nothing to do with them. Her message, roughly, Limpopo manages its own affairs within the law and won't tolerate anything that threatens peace or people's livelihood. That is not a foreign government pushing back. This is not Nigeria. It's not Ghana. It's not international community. That's a sitting South African premier drawing a line. And this is exactly what I meant about South Africans being mistaken for foreigners. There is an ethnic group inside South Africa, the Vachonga, also called Shanghai, who kept getting stopped by March and March protesters because of how they sound, how they look, or their surname. They marched to the Human Rights Commission, and some people have alleged that the mistaken identity has already cost life. Now think about what that means. A movement created on protecting real South Africans can't really tell who is real South African. It was never really about papers. It was how Africans sound. Now, while Limpopo drew that line, another front opened up. South Africa's own Human Rights Commission filed a case against Jacinta and others, accusing them of inciting xenophobic violence. Now, to be clear, that's an allegation moving through the courts, not a conviction. Nothing has been proven yet. Now, see what it means that her own country's human rights body felt it had to take that step. Okay, let's put everything on the table. South Africa stands on the world's highest court, demanding accountability for atrocity carried out thousands of kilometers away from South Africa. At home, vigilante groups control who get into hospital. Ghana takes the complaint to the African Union. Nigeria reminds South Africa that freedom actually costs. A sitting premier tells the movement to stay out of her province. South Africans get mistaken for the exact foreigners they are marching against. That's a country whose actions at home no longer matches the voices it uses abroad. That's the exact moment that African leaders started asking quietly, at first, whether South Africa should continue holding the microphone for the continent. Not out of spite, out of a simple fair question. Can you speak for a family you are currently failing to protect? Now, I don't really think this is really about one movement, one activist, or even one country. It is about what the continent does when it has to decide in real time what solidarity means once it costs something. Now, South Africa has three paths here. 1. Clean down agoraphobia and rebuild the trust is pending down. Keep talking loudly abroad while the gap at home keeps widening. The continent build something it has never had, a shared voice. When Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and Egypt aren't waiting on one capital to speak for all 54 countries, maybe the real story isn't that South Africa is losing its voice. Maybe the real story is that Africa is learning that it never needed just one voice. The real question now is this: what would genuine Pan-African solidarity looks like, not in speeches, but in actions, and who will step forward to build it? So guys, what do you think about what is happening? Whatever you feel about this or whatever you think about this, just let it be in the comment section. Thank you for watching this channel. Peace.